Okay, we're back from the break. I just wanted to say that this is actually the next day. We decided not to go right back to work after the break yesterday, and so it's the next day, next evening actually. And so we're going to pick up where we left off. I'm going to jump into this article from TAC. It's TAC for short, 10th Amendment Center. So we'll just call it TAC, the 10th Amendment Center, and this article of theirs here covering gun sanctuary counties, and also it goes into somewhat into immigration sanctuary issues. And we'll cover some of that and take a look at some of those things. Now, while I'm on the subject, I'm going to read some of this stuff that's in here, and then we'll talk about it a little bit. But I'm going to relay a little bit of a story that happened back when I was first in the military police, and we were enforcing the police codes there in the military police. And anyway, I'm sure you know what reckless driving is and careless driving is. Well, anyway, we were issuing citations there. We had two kinds of citations that we issued. One was a military citation, and the other one was a federal magistrate's citation that we issued. We were actually authorized to issue one type of citation to military personnel and another type of citation to civilians driving through the military post, because we had Fort Riley, where I was, actually had a highway going right through the fort. So we had civilians driving through the fort, and we issued them federal magistrate tickets. But anyway, we would issue these tickets, and these tickets would be turned in at the end of shift, and the sergeants and the lieutenants and them would take a look at them. Well, one citation popped up that said carless driving on it instead of careless driving. And they thought that was pretty funny. They says, well, that's pretty funny, you know, carless driving. How do you get a ticket for carless driving? I just want to stress to you the importance when you're dealing with legal terminology, when you're dealing with developing paperwork that have anything to do with law. Don't leave any letters out, you see. That's just one letter. That's just an E that got left off of careless driving and it became carless driving. And that's important. And it would have been the end of it, because they had a nice little laugh because one of the MPs wrote carless driving, until they got a second ticket that also said carless driving, and it then ceased to be funny. But anyway, let me explain. If you're going to be involved in reading legal statutes, if you're going to be involved in reading legal paperwork or reports or whatever, laws especially, words that are left out mean something. Letters that are left out mean something. Sometimes it boils down to something as simple as punctuation, where a comma was left out and the comma should have been there, and if the comma was there, it changed the meaning of the law. So you have to think of that. The other thing is strategies. Your strategy has to be somewhat well-founded and have some reasonable chance of being a good lawful strategy when you go into these things. I just wanted to mention that, and then when we go reading this, maybe you'll see that when you strategize, when you leave letters out, when you leave words out, it can cause a big problem. All right, let's go and read here from, I'll start right at the beginning. Today, I talked with an NBC News reporter about efforts to pass Second Amendment resolutions and ordinances in counties and towns. Unfortunately for gun rights activists, none of them being reported on do what most supporters and pundits have been telling that they do. That these actions didn't actually do what they hoped they would do. Almost all coverage I found on the effort, whether through blogs or mainstream media, has claimed resolutions recently passed in some Illinois localities creating gun sanctuary counties but they don't actually work. And we're going to, I've already in the previous block of instruction, you kind of get an idea of why these things are not well founded upon legal principles and legal doctrines. And I'm not going to repeat that. We're just going to jump in here. All right. Many others have referred to these efforts as a gun sanctuary resolution, okay? They're telling people that the resolutions passed are similar in practice and strategy as immigration sanctuary cities. Brian Kibler, the top prosecutor of Effingham County, Illinois, told Fox News that the resolutions that were passed aren't much different from cities such as Chicago, which refuse to cooperate with federal immigration authorities. Now, we're going to talk about this a little bit, this refusal to cooperate. Or what some of the people have said, they said, we're just not going to comply. Will not comply. Individuals said, well, if they pass this or that kind of a law, I'm just not going to comply. And we're going to get into how effective that is or isn't. You see, I'm not saying that there is no cause for non-compliance or is no cause for non-cooperation. In some cases, there is cause. However, the details matter, okay? And it says here, but he was wrong. They're quite different. In fact, they're not even close. As the NBC reporter was doing research for his story, he was told that the effort originated in Oregon back in 2013. That's, of course, my state where I'm at here. Then someone told him that the 10th Amendment Center, we're going to just say TAC, TAC was a source of help in that effort there and was focused on passing Second Amendment preservation ordinances. Since this didn't come across to me as true, I decided to call him and chat about it. I first wanted to make clear that TAC was not involved in the Oregon effort and were not involved in the Illinois effort as well. So TAC wasn't even involved in those two efforts. I suggested that the person in Oregon may have been trying to say that they were inspired by our work. By our work, they mean by TAC's work. Or motivated to model their effort after our recommended local Second Amendment preservation ordinance model of legislation. So evidently TAC did have a model for legislation for creating Second Amendment preservation ordinances. As I said previously in the previous block of instruction, TAC can have done that. They can have said, well, we kind of got a model here for creating these Second Amendment preservation ordinances, but still, you have to understand, a county has no sovereign standing to override the sovereign standing of the state. To make an ordinance, they can make an ordinance like that. Whether it will have any real weighty effect is entirely another matter. However, the measures being passed in both Oregon and Illinois are far different than what we've urged localities to pass. The difference may appear to be technical, but it's actually quite significant. Now, under the heading of directive versus statement. So they're saying that, if a ordinance that you pass is a simple directive, or if it's just a statement. Our model ordinance here at TAC declares all federal gun laws unconstitutional. So that's the approach or the strategy of TAC. They're saying that we're declaring all federal gun laws unconstitutional. All federal acts, laws, orders, rules, or regulations regarding firearms, firearm accessories, and ammunition are a violation of the Second Amendment. This, of course, takes us back to shall not be infringed in the Second Amendment. And that's not a frivolous argument. The Second Amendment, while it did not grant you the right to keep and bear arms, it does, in fact, work as a infringement clause which tells the government you shall not infringe this right. And there is a difference, of course, and I think you kind of got that idea already. Based on this declaration, it bans the locality from helping enforce or effectuate any of such violations. I'm reading here from, this is evidently part of their recommendation of how you can proceed. It reads here, no agent, employee, or official of the county, city, or town, or any corporation providing services to the county, city, or town, shall provide material support or participate in any way with the implementation of federal acts, orders, rules, laws, or regulations in violation of the Second Amendment to the United States Constitution. So this is more or less that you won't provide any services in assistance of or furtherance of this unconstitutional federal law that comes down and it's in violation of the Second Amendment. Basically, that's what that says. Okay, in short, passage of this ordinance immediately changes how local resources are used and bans all government agencies, including police, from participating in enforcement of any federal gun control measures. It's a directive to law enforcement, not a statement of principles or a request. See, it's a directive. On the other hand, the so-called gun rights sanctuary resolution passed in Effington County includes no immediate directive for law enforcement to start or stop doing anything whatsoever. Instead, the resolution issues two demands. The first demand is, first, to the Illinois General Assembly to cease further actions restricting the rights of people to keep and bear arms. That's their first demand. Second demand is to the governor, and it says, veto all such legislation which restricts the right of the people to keep and bear arms. So that's what that strategy was about. After the demands comes an attempt at a directive, but it includes a caveat so big it renders the resolution ineffective in practice. Let me read that again. I did a fairly poor job. After the demand comes an attempt at a directive, but it includes a caveat so big it renders the resolution ineffective in practice. Okay, this is an attempt at a directive, and it reads like this. If the government of the state of Illinois shall infringe upon the inalienable rights granted by the Second Amendment. See, there's already a problem right there, of course, in the wording. It says, if the government of the state of Illinois shall infringe upon the inalienable rights granted by the Second Amendment. What's the problem with that? Okay, an inalienable right is not granted by the Second Amendment. That's the problem with that. I've already explained that in fairly good detail. So there you got a problem right there. Effington County shall become a sanctuary county for all firearms unconstitutionally prohibited by the government of the state of Illinois, in that Effington County will prohibit its employees from enforcing the unconstitutional actions of the state government. Emphasis added. Okay, so we get what they're saying there. I have to wonder with this attempt at a directive whether there were, or what kind of lawyers were involved in the drafting of this. Because right away you've got some problems right here in the wording that was used to put this together. Not the least of which is where it says, shall infringe upon the inalienable rights granted by the Second Amendment, which they are not. Nobody, I assume nobody pointed that out to anyone. Okay, let's go on. Notice that the resolution doesn't define what is unconstitutionally prohibited, or what constitutes an unconstitutional action. It doesn't define that. And in the law, you would want to define that. Somebody would have to make that determination before the county could take any action. Okay, now here's where we start to really get into it. Let me read it again. Notice that the resolution doesn't define what is unconstitutionally prohibited or what constitutes an unconstitutional action. Somebody would have to make the determination before the county could take any action. The question is, I wrote here on the side here, who determines the constitutionality issues? Does the county do that? And even if they did say something was unconstitutional or constitutional one way or the other, but then they didn't proceed to define what it was that made it, that you've got to define what it is, how this unconstitutionally prohibition is working, you see. How is it unconstitutional? Why is it unconstitutional? You have to explain all that, okay? In short, the Effington resolution doesn't address federal gun laws in any way and is waiting for a determination of unconstitutionality before ending enforcement of the state laws that unconstitutionally prohibit firearms. So they're saying if it's found to be unconstitutional, yes, we will stop enforcement. It doesn't do anything until that point. Somebody's got to determine the constitutionality issue. And if it is not judged to be, properly judged, by the way, to be unconstitutional, nothing happens. They're actually, the wording here actually ends up being, well, we're waiting for somebody to declare it unconstitutional who has that authority to do that, and then we'll stop enforcing it. And they would, like I said, they would have to have defined what all these things mean, okay? Kibler admitted to USA Today that the action is largely symbolic. And Sheriff Dave Mahon told the Effington Daily News that passage would not dictate how his office enforces the law. He said it wouldn't dictate that. In other words, it has no practical effect at all. All right. Similar resolutions have passed in a handful of other Illinois counties, none with any significant differences from this. Comparing these to immigration sanctuary cities might be an even bigger stretch. Okay, now we're going to talk for a little bit about immigration sanctuaries. Using the San Francisco Sanctuary City Ordinance as an example, it's easy to see the stark difference in the approach between immigration sanctuary cities and the so-called gun rights sanctuary cities being passed in Illinois and elsewhere. First, passed in 1989 and last amended in 2016, San Francisco Administrative Code 12H-12I, I believe it is. It's not another one. I was going to say 12.1, but it doesn't say one. I think it's an I. Takes an approach completely opposite to that of Effington County. Instead of waiting for a determination that an act is unconstitutional and then ending enforcement of the act, San Francisco immediately ends enforcement assistance for most federal immigration laws and will only help if there is a determination that they're required to do so. It reads, in part, no department, agency, commission, officer, or employee of the city and county of San Francisco shall use any city funds or resources to assist in the enforcement of federal immigration law, or to gather or disseminate information regarding release status of individuals or any other such personal information as defined in Chapter 12I in the City and County of San Francisco, unless such assistance is required by federal or state statute, regulation, or court decision. This prohibition is in effect right now in San Francisco and includes, but is not limited to, and I'll read from that, assisting or cooperating in one's official capacity with any investigation, detention, or arrest procedures, public or clandestine, conducted by the federal agency charged with the enforcement of the federal immigration law and relating to alleged violations of civil provisions of the federal immigration law, except as permitted by Administrative Code Section 12I.3, which is back to the San Francisco Administrative Code. There is no similar prohibition in effect in Effingham County at all. Now we're going to talk a little bit about what's happening in Oregon. Okay. While this effort to create gun sanctuary cities in Illinois was inspired by efforts in Oregon, the localities passing resolutions there are just as ineffective in practice. Take Coos County, for example, where the Second Amendment Preservation Ordinance was passed in early 2015. After a series of whereas clauses, which are merely statements of intent or findings without any legal effect, the enacting clauses that start with therefore or do ordain provide no directive to end enforcement of any gun law, state or federal. It reads in part, this is what it reads in part, this is from Coos County, Oregon. Any regulation of the right to keep and bear arms or ancillary firearms rights that violate the 2nd, 9th, 10th, or 14th Amendments to the Constitution of the United States of America, or Article 1, Sections 27 and 33 of the Constitution of the State of Oregon, as articulated herein, shall be regarded by the people on and in Coos County as unconstitutional, a transgression of the supreme law of the land and its spirit of liberty, and therefore by necessity is void ab initio. Void ab initio means from its very start. Okay. In short, the ordinance voters passed says that if a regulation of the right to keep and bear arms is deemed to be a violation of the Constitution, the people of Coos County will regard it as unconstitutional. Okay. Here, I made some notes on the side here. The problem that you have here is we have a vote occurring where the voters in Coos County have supported this legislation and have said that they're going to deem it a violation of the Constitution, and that the people of Coos County will regard it as unconstitutional. Here's the problem. They agreed otherwise. This is what I wrote. No timely withdrawal of consent and agreement exists. Now, what am I talking about? What consent and agreement? The consent and agreement as both citizens of your state and of the United States, where you have agreed to abide by the system of voting and legislation and representative government and everything it includes of how it works. Well, the way it works is, number one, that the judiciary has the job of declaring things constitutional and unconstitutional. Do the citizens directly do that? Do they? It says here, in short, the ordinance voters passed says that if the regulation of the right to keep and bear arms is deemed a violation of the Constitution, do the citizens, are they empowered to do that once they've agreed to the system that we have in place? I would say no. I would say that's frivolous. The people of the Coos County will regard it as unconstitutional. Well, that's like saying, I won't comply. I won't comply. You see? Most of the time, I won't comply is not a good legal strategy. And I've explained this before, because the police, of which I used to be one, are quite adept at dealing with people who won't comply. And they're going to do mean, terrible, and awful things to you in order to get you to comply. And we have to take that into account. Now, you can't just say, well, wait a second, Pastor Mike, I didn't agree to all this. Yes, you did. Or maybe you did so unknowingly. I'll give you that much. Maybe you didn't understand all the ins and outs of it. I'll give you that too. Now, as people like me and others maybe that you have looked at their presentations and you say, well, I'm starting to understand, I may have failed to do some things and may have failed to undo some things that I agreed to. Yes, that's correct. When you agree to a constitution that has branches of government that operate a certain way, and that constitutionality issues are decided almost all of the time in the judiciary, that's where these constitutional issues are decided, then the people don't get to just jump up and say, well, I'll just declare the thing unconstitutional. And if some county says they're going to make an ordinance, a Second Amendment preservation ordinance, and I'm going to vote for it, well, there you go. I'm voting for it. That's a done deal. I voted for it. Not exactly. Not exactly. Yes, you voted for it. Yes, the ordinance became a county ordinance. That doesn't mean that's the end of it. Who has the final decision on this stuff? You see, because there's a hierarchy of power which takes place. And in the courts, that's the appellate system. They get to decide whether the thing is constitutional or not constitutional. You agreed to that. You don't get to just say, my word is the final word. It is not the final word. It might be nice if it was, but it isn't. Okay? All right, let's go on. On its own, this does absolutely nothing. The ordinance then includes a directive of sorts to end enforcement of gun laws. It reads like this: the Coos County government will not authorize or appropriate governmental funds, resources, employees, agencies, contractors, buildings, detention centers, or offices for the purpose of enforcing any element of such acts. Well, they used the phrase such acts there. I wouldn't have used such acts. I would have said these unconstitutional laws and acts that have to do with violations of the Second Amendment. Such acts is a kind of a vague phrase, and you could sit there in court and argue about what does such acts refer to, and everybody may know what it refers to, but I've seen this happen in court. They'll start arguing over the wording. But the phrase such acts, it says here, refers to those previous sections that have been deemed unconstitutional. With that additional clause, the ordinance is saying if a gun law regulation is deemed a violation of the Constitution, the people of Coos County will regard it as unconstitutional, and the county government will not help enforce it. All right, what did I write here? I wrote, attorneys should have clarified the situation. Yes, I agree. The attorneys that were advising, or could have been advising, the legislators there in the county should have said, well, there's some ins and outs to this that you need to consider. And I don't know if that happened. I really can't say because I wasn't there. But anyway, I think some better legal advice might have been a good place to start. Okay, the ordinance does allow for the sheriff to make that constitutional determination, but without that additional step, no enforcement ends the practice. Okay. Again, the judiciary is the one who, that's their job to decide this constitutional or unconstitutional. It says here the ordinance does allow for the sheriff to make the constitutional determination, but that's not enough. He can be overridden by the courts, by the judiciary. And so how long is this going to fly? Similar ordinances were passed in Wheeler, Wallowa, Curry, and Curry counties, and will be on the ballot in Columbia, Klamath County is where I am, this fall. Weaker resolutions without any attempt to end enforcement of anything were passed in Douglas, Lynn, Yamhill, and Baker counties. Strategy and backbone. Okay. While San Francisco and many other cities immediately withdrew resources from the enforcement of federal immigration laws and continue to do so, only to change course if they're required to do otherwise, Effingham, Coos, and other counties are going the opposite direction on guns. They're changing absolutely nothing today. They're not ending any enforcement right now. They're waiting to be told at some undetermined point in the future that it's unconstitutional. I guess that's what they're waiting for, at which time they will end enforcement. However, they can do something right now if they simply change the approach used in their resolutions and ordinances. Instead of including a clause saying that they'll stop enforcement if an act is determined to be unconstitutional, they can follow the approach in tax model of Second Amendment preservation ordinances by banning assistance to federal gun control measures immediately. Okay? The strategy of opting out without first asking is based on James Madison's advice in the Federalist number 46 that states and individuals should use a refusal to cooperate with the officers of the Union as an effective way to oppose and end them. The strategy has been upheld repeatedly by the Supreme Court in the anti-commandeering doctrine based on a series of 5 landmark cases from 1842 to 2018. Be aware, however, I wrote here on the side, this could cause public officers and officials to lose their jobs. And they may have to give them their jobs back once you go through a whole legal procedure to get that done, depending on the fact pattern involved and the way the laws are being applied and adjudicated. This strategy isn't just sound as far as constitutional principle and court precedent is concerned. It's extremely effective as well. If immigration sanctuary cities weren't having any effect undermining federal immigration enforcement, no one would be complaining about them or trying to stop them. They'd be laughed off as grandstanding political efforts to whip up donations and votes. Judge Napolitano said that he put it this way in 2014, doing the same on gun control measures would make them nearly impossible to enforce as well. If gun rights supporters are serious about ending enforcement of gun laws, they should work on legislative efforts that actually end enforcement. And that's basically the end of the article. Okay, what I want to talk a little bit about, hang on just a second. By the way, this is carrot juice, good for you. If you get a chance, you should drink carrot juice too. All right, now, the problem that you're going to have here, yes, you can probably cause these people some problems by saying, I'm not going to cooperate. Now, one of the ways you cannot cooperate is say, we're not going to use any funds, any of our funds, to help in these efforts. Because if the federal government tries to use local authorities to have people jailed or whatever, then the local people are using their funds to get this done. They're putting you in the county jail or whatever, and that's being paid for at the county level. Well, that's only a funding issue. Now, there are all kinds of funding related consequences that could happen. The federal government could say, we're going to pull some of our federal funding. If you don't do what we say, we'll take away some of your federal funding. And that's been recently been ruled to be okay by the courts, that they could do that. that they
specifically around the sanctuary cities for immigration.
Yeah, sanctuary cities for immigration. They can say, well, they can pull their federal funding, which means you're going to get less money. Okay, there's another way that this could go, and they could say, well, okay, you don't want to use any county funds to help us. Well, then the federal government's going to fund it themselves. And then, in other words, then they will pay the jail for federal enforcement action. And that's just a funding, that's just who's going to pay issue. You see, who's going to pay? The county, local people going to pay, or is the federal government going to pay? Well, the federal government's fully empowered to say, we'll pay. Then, yeah.
It doesn't seem quite as simple as that. Most of those things you read said that they won't, it's not just the funding for the...
I'm just only talking, I'm only talking about funding right now.
They said resources, employees, anything.
Right. I'm only talking about funding right now. Just funding. As far as funding is concerned, they could do that. They could say, we'll pay. Now, as my son points out, they weren't talking about only funding. You could solve the funding issue that way, though. You could say, we'll pay. Now they'll say they won't apply any of their resources, or they're not going to apply any of their personnel. They're not going to, all of that kind of stuff. Okay, well, the federal government could say, all right, you don't want to use your resources and you don't want to use your personnel, we'll bring in our resources and personnel. That could happen too. Now, it gets to be a big pain for the federal government as this goes on, but they could do it. And so therefore, what I'm trying to say here in a roundabout way is there are ways around some of these strategies that maybe we haven't thought of, or maybe we have thought of, but we discounted them as being important. The truth is we need to come up with a strategy that doesn't allow all that to cause us more trouble. Because if they say we'll pay, we'll use our own people, we'll use our own resources, then the effort is going to go ahead, obviously. Yeah.
Would you say that the court's recent decision that the federal government can pull all federal funds from any sanctuary city, county, or state that won't cooperate with illegal immigration, would that rule work equally the same, or essentially the same, with the sanctuary cities and counties of the Second Amendment people?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, if you got a club, I would call it we're going to withdraw our funding club. Yeah. Why would you just club it in one place? Wouldn't you be clubbing it in other places too? Yeah. And I think that they could do that. Yes, they could say, well, okay, you don't want to cooperate with us. Well, we'll just pull funding for that. Yeah. So the point is, and we all know that local governments get federal funding. And if they pull that federal funding, that's going to have an impact, a financial impact on local government.
We can't depend on it.
Yeah, I would say that it wouldn't be wrong to say they depend on it. Yeah.
The one thing I had a question about here is they're addressing the gun issue almost exclusively around the federal government and federal government laws and federal acts. Mm-hmm. In most of these cases, like here in Oregon, in California, in Illinois, in New York, in Virginia, what's going on now, and in at least a dozen other states, the vast majority of this is being done at the state level.
At the state level, yeah.
So I don't know if that changes things as far as how they would handle it, but I mean, in this case, they're generally not trying to go against the federal government. In most cases, they're trying to go against their own state.
Exactly. It does change it because the fact pattern changed. You know that, first of all, the sovereign that you're fighting is not the same sovereign. Now the sovereign you're fighting is the state, you see. Before, when you were fighting the sovereign, it was the federal government. And depending on how you proceed to strategize and fight against this, it does make a difference. Now, that's true. A lot of these efforts are coming down from the state, these unconstitutional laws. Well, the first thing that I would do, we already know pretty well what the Second Amendment is all about. What I would do is go to the state constitution and see if there's anything there about the right to keep and bear arms that you could use. You see, it probably won't be as well worded as the Second Amendment is. But anyway, at this point, we already have the advantage of having the Second Amendment having been incorporated onto the states. So you can use the Second Amendment in that fashion, even at the state level. Therefore, even if you don't find anything in the Constitution of your state, you can still use the Second Amendment because it's been incorporated. But some of this action from TAC is based on the 9th and 10th Amendments, and let's see, I think they listed it here when I read it, based on amendments that some of which have not been incorporated onto the states. The 9th and 10th Amendments have not been incorporated onto the states. So you're not going to be able to use those directly as if they had been incorporated onto the states. And we have to remember that. The strategy to, first of all, I don't want to start to go outside of sanctuary counties and towns and cities and municipalities, because that's outside the scope of what we're talking about. Remember that the counties and the cities don't have sovereign status to trump the sovereign status of the state or the federal government. They don't have that. The only hope that you do have is to have Trump, or to have sovereignty trump sovereignty. Now, what you're going to have to do, if you wanted to do that, which is a possibility, but it's some things have to change before you can do that. You can't, the people are sovereign, okay? The sovereignty starts with the people, but they have impaired their own sovereign status by agreeing to have things done a certain way. That's why I keep going back to consent and agreement. And until you do something about that, how do the sovereign people, as sovereign people with an unimpaired sovereignty, trump the sovereignty of the state? How would you do that? How would you go about that? Some steps have to be taken. It's just like in that one movie. I'm not going to say what the movie is, but one guy says steps. We have to take steps, you see. And those are steps that we need to contemplate. We need to strategize. We need to do. Now, I have worked pretty hard to try and explain that you must withdraw your consent to have your inherent and inalienable rights voted upon. They should not be voted in or out of your life. They should be outside of a vote, outside of infringement by a voting process. And if we don't adhere to that, if we don't adhere to saying, because they're going to assume and presume consent from you, and when you don't do anything about it, they are silence denotes agreement, and they'll continue to say, nope, we have your consent. That's a strategy that I'm kind of following up. I'm not. See, there's more to the strategy than what I've told you so far. But I just wanted to be honest with you. Here I'll be honest with you. When it comes to the Second Amendment issues, when it comes to the right of self-protection, and when it comes to the right to keep and bear arms, I'm not making very good headway with some of these 2A people and the people themselves. They are so indoctrinated and conditioned to believe that the Second Amendment is all, that I have a tough time breaking through that barrier. No matter what I say, if I talk about inherent and inalienable rights, they're still thinking the Second Amendment is the whole of their right. You see, it all flows from the Second Amendment. It's like what they wrote here, which is just plainly horrible wording. It says, if the government of the state of Illinois shall infringe upon the inalienable rights granted by the Second Amendment. Can you imagine? I mean, think of that wording. Think of that wording.
They cut their own throats with that wording.
They cut their own throats with that wording. The Second Amendment doesn't grant any inalienable rights at all, period. The only thing the Second Amendment does is to say that the government cannot infringe the inalienable and inherent rights that you already had and that were not granted by the Second Amendment or the government. But this is going into legislation. I assume that legal professionals are involved in this. And so it boggles the mind how people can write something like this, you see. And what did I say at the very beginning? I said that spelling is important. You leave a letter out, you're messed up. You leave words out or put words in that shouldn't be there, you're messed up. Your strategy doesn't hold water, you're again messed up. And that's what we're dealing with. Did you have something you wanted to bring up?
Yes. Because a state is sovereign, for example, recently Minnesota passed some laws and rules that prohibited the use of resources, funds, things like that, same
Right.
as the cities and counties ordinances, but they did this at a state level to prevent their state and the federal government from going after their gun rights. Would that have more validity than, obviously it would have more validity than what the city or county does?
Right.
But do you think they would ultimately lose that battle of sovereignty and maybe under the supremacy clause or for other reasons?
Okay. What we have to do is work the problem. Okay. Yes, if the state is the one who's protecting your Second Amendment protection against infringement, you see, they're sovereign at that level. And if they're fighting the federal government, they're sovereign. I said that sovereignty trumps sovereignty, right? But what is the problem in the sovereignty trumping sovereignty there? The problem is that the states have agreed that the ultimate determination of constitutionality rests with the U.S. Supreme Court. That's your problem. They've agreed and acquiesced to that. And they said that they will abide by the U.S. Constitution. The U.S. constitutional plan says that the federal government makes that final determination. Also, when you start with Marbury versus Madison and the doctrine of judicial review, since Marbury, we know that the federal government can review a state law and declare it constitutional or unconstitutional. There you have that. Have they objected to that? Well, we've got, a long time period now of nobody's objecting to that.
Well, there was objection at the time, but it was ultimately determined that they could do it.
Right. Well, it's kind of like with the Supreme Court. If you say to the Supreme Court, well, I think you're wrong, well, and the Supreme Court says, yeah, but we're charged with the authority to make the final decision. So if you think I'm wrong, just put the question to me and I'll decide whether I'm wrong or not. You see, because they hold the final authority on what is constitutional and not constitutional. Unless that changes, the sovereignty of the state has an estoppel problem and has a agreement problem and consent problem where whenever they say, well, okay, the federal government makes that decision, we can't correct that. Otherwise, will a pure sovereignty, an unimpaired sovereignty of the state where there are no such agreements, where they acquiesce some of their sovereignty to the federal government, if that didn't exist, could sovereignty at the state level trump sovereignty? Theoretically, yes. Yes, it could. Although, there's one thing that can overcome sovereignty trumping sovereignty, and that's force. Okay? Cannon fire and gunfire and force can overcome even sovereignty trumping sovereignty. Then it becomes a matter of bloodletting and force. And of course, that's exactly, I don't want to go into it too deeply, but it's exactly already happened before in history when the southern states wanted to secede from the Union based on their sovereign rights, because they were thinking back to the Articles of Confederation in 1778, where the states were fully sovereign. Not thinking about that at the Constitution, at the passing of the Constitution, they acquiesced some of their sovereignty to the federal government. But anyway, the thing is you're impairing the fullness of your sovereignty at various levels. Now, the way it went, the Union was formed at the Constitution, when the Constitution came in, and we had a United States at that point. Some of the state sovereignty was acquiesced, and given to the federal government. They didn't know exactly what all that meant yet. You see, this is, well, we're building a country, United States, that's good for everybody, and, we need to be a whole country just in case we have to repel invasion from other countries and all that, to preserve us as a nation. I'm not against any of that. That all makes sense. The problem is that the southern states did not realize that how much sovereignty it actually lost. That came to their attention later, and then the Civil War began, and they said, "Look, you can't do this to us." And the Northern government and the U.S. government said, "Yes, we can," and the rest of the story. So they lost the Civil War, and then the 14th Amendment came in, so on and so forth. So actually, Judge Napolitano argues this. He says, "Huh." Napolitano, yeah. He argues that, and I tend to agree with him, he argues several things. He argues that the southern states had a right to secede from the Union, and they hadn't ever given up that right. And they were, of course, prevented from doing that by the Civil War. However, there are also arguments that say, look, slavery would have ended in any event. Slavery was already on the decline all over the world. England was involved in being anti-slavery. Different places were already talking anti-slavery. Regardless of the Civil War, slavery would have eventually ended anyway. The Civil War was not as much about slavery as it was about states' rights. And what we don't want to face and what we don't want to acknowledge, maybe some do, but some don't, is that the states created the federal government. And when they created the federal government, and the people, of course, I said the states, the people and the states created the federal government. And then they put limitations, constitutional limitations, on the powers of the federal government. And if they exceed those powers, then the agreement, it's a breach of agreement, more or less. They said, you didn't stick with the agreement. You overshot your powers. And now we're going to say that we are the ones that created you, so we can then leave. You see, we can then exit the contract because you didn't abide by the terms of the contract. Actually, that's sound legal thinking. Unless, of course, they start pointing cannons at you, then that changes things. Because if you lose the war, then one person said it this way, if you get whipped in a war, usually you stay whipped. Not always, but usually so. And so that's how history progressed. You can get scholars from all over to analyze all this and say, well, we think it means this, and another guy says, well, I think it means that. That's great. I'm just one of the guys who has my own theory on how things should work and how things should have worked and whether they were legal. There are some very valid arguments supporting what I've been saying for the past few minutes. So, yes, under normal circumstances, sovereignty can trump sovereignty unless you do something yourself which prevents it in some way. That's the rule. Now, let's wrap this up. What does that give you? If the state were the ones trying to preserve our Second Amendment rights, I say Second Amendment rights with a lump in my throat because they're not Second Amendment rights really, but anyway, if the state tries to do that, and they can't get it done, and then counties try these sanctuary counties, and that doesn't work, and then cities try, maybe a city will try a sanctuary municipality, and that doesn't work. Well, it boils down to only a few things being left. One of them is the people are sovereign. Yes, there is a way for the people to use their sovereignty to trump the other sovereignty. There is a way, but it's complicated. I just told you that you have to do some certain things. You have to get your house in order before you can move forward with that. There's one other way, which I'm not going to flesh out in this particular video, and that is the sovereignty of God, which of course is not recognized within our legal system right now. They're not acknowledging the sovereignty of God on a legal basis within our legal system. That's a problem. It has to be overcome. But the point is, if you asked yourself, now this is for the people out there that I'm talking to who are believers in the biblical God. The biblical God is sovereign. Can we use his sovereignty? And the answer is yes. But you have to know how to bring those issues forward. Is there anything else?
Yes. A bit ago you were talking about the states. We were talking about if a state created ordinances and stuff, and you said, but the states have agreed that the U.S. Supreme Court is the ultimate arbiter of what is and is not constitutional.
Mm-hmm.
It sounds like we have, perhaps unintentionally, created a de facto state where 9 justices of the U.S. Supreme Court are the ultimate arbiters of your rights, and the Constitution means whatever they say it means. And perhaps that's what Scalia meant when he said that the Supreme Court was rewriting the Constitution.
Mm-hmm.
Do you know what I mean?
Well, they're using, that brings in a whole other bunch of stuff. The Constitution, I've got it right here in this little booklet, and there's also, it's available to us. We can read it. It says what it says. Now, when we say, in terms of comparison, if it says here that ducks are ducks, and then the court says, no, ducks aren't ducks, they're something else. But it says here ducks, though. I read ducks. So it isn't like we can't read this. It's written down. We can read it. When they step so far outside of the actual meaning of the Constitution and just rely upon their power to do whatever it is, we are the final word on what it means. But there's a limit. There's a limit to what even how far that can go. You see, now, like I said, I hope some of these problems can be straightened out. I hope we can do this short of people resorting to violence. Like I said before, I am doing everything I can to bring forward enough information so that these legal issues can be resolved peacefully without people saying, I don't know what else to do now. I guess I have to fight for my life to keep my right to keep and bear arms, so that I have my right to life and my right of self-protection. All I can say is I can't guarantee you that you won't lose your right to keep and bear arms. I can't guarantee you that. I can guarantee you that I'm trying everything I can do to prevent it and do so peacefully. That I can tell you. If they don't play by the rules, and they change the rules of the sandbox that we play in, and then they start changing definitions. I made a video called the smoke and mirror shell game. When they start changing definitions, when they start recategorizing, changing things all over the place, well then what do you do? You're going to be in a mess. Now, the Declaration of Independence tells us when government becomes that dysfunctional, where they no longer work, it no longer works like it's supposed to work, it falls on the people to try to correct that. It falls on the people. And there's no other way that I know of to tell you that. The people are the last line of defense, unless the people want to throw up their hands and say, well, I guess we're just not a free people really anymore, and then that's it. And our freedoms are gone. We have to set our differences aside, and we have to do everything we can to preserve rights, freedom, and liberty. And if we do not do that, we have not become worthy to hold liberty. That's what it boils down to. We need to be doing that. Anything else? No? Okay, I'm going to end this. I have planned in the future to make another video on checks and balances, because that's important. And so that's something that I'll most likely after this video be working on. With that, I say this is Pastor Mike Benjamins in Southern Oregon saying take care and God bless.